Okay, what we're going to do in this video is see how we can get the effect of, say, rain falling down a window, condensation rolling down a can, that type of effect. Of course, using MoGraph and effectors in fields and all sorts of fun stuff. Now, we're also going to build this project from scratch as well after I show you the basics, including the modeling and lighting and materials. So let's go ahead and get started. All right, so this is kind of the end result we're going to be aiming for, or something similar. As I'll show you in a second, this scene is quite heavy, so I'll probably keep the droplets a little bit larger so I can use fewer of them. But essentially, what we're going to do is use MoGraph to create these droplets, to have them gently kind of cascade down this window. It could be a can. And we're also going to use the trail they create using a vertex map to affect the roughness of the material. And so hopefully that's coming through in the preview as well. Now, I also experimented with an emitter to get some kind of rain out in the background. We'll see if we can get that looking good. Unfortunately, because it's using motion blur, you have to do a full render each time, and that can be rather time consuming. So before we get started, I want to point out that I am using an image from this website called Pexels. It's free stock imagery. I searched for rainy city, and this is what I got. And while this isn't perfect, because for one, we're in the middle of the street, which is a weird place to kind of make a window, but maybe the road turns. Um, the other thing is I don't have an HDRI of this to help me light this project. And so what I'm doing is just kind of cheating this. So I'm going to make sure I copy my dome light just in case. Good thing I did. Okay, should actually just get that image in there. I can reload it, but I just loaded the image into the texture spot of our dome light here, and that should actually do an okay job, especially for our purposes today where we're focusing on the MoGraph stuff. So let's go ahead and get started on the MoGraph. We can fix the dome light later on. I just created a plane. I'm going to change its orientation to positive X and make the the height half the width. And that will help with the proportions with the number of segments here, because I do want to keep these square because we are going to be using a vertex map. And so, yeah, two here, let's just do 200 and 100. All right, to get us started with our little squares there. So there's kind of our basic window. I'll also hide our work plane because it was bothering me. And from here, what we're going to do is create our little droplets. And there's a whole bunch of different shapes you could use. I'm going to start with a regular sphere for one of them. I'll duplicate it 2 more times by holding Control or Command and just dragging it out. I think one of them I'm going to make editable by either using the shortcut key C or hitting this button. Go into point mode, select that point, and I'm going to use soft selection with this. So switch to my move tool, enable soft selection, and honestly, just pull that up. Give me a little bit of a droplet shape. With this one, I'm going to make it editable as well. Scale it out on the sides a little bit, just to try and create some different shapes here. So maybe I'll select the top and bottom with this, kind of scale that in to give us, once again, just a little bit different shape, maybe even expand that just a touch before we do that. Yeah, there we go. So maybe something like that. These are obviously way too large, but it was a bit easier to do this with them this large. I did make that third sphere editable, and I'm going to just scale this down, right? And this is kind of where I'm going to try and simplify things just a bit to keep things playing back really quickly, because I don't know if I showed it in here previously, but you can see this is a heavy scene. I've switched to it, and it still hasn't loaded. And yeah, as I try and navigate to another frame, you can see it's going to take a second to go to that. So the playback was awfully slow, and we're going to try and make things a little bit better here by starting larger. And then it's really just about scaling down the size of these things, but then using more copies of them. We're going to use a cloner to help us with this. So I'll create one of those and put all 3 spheres inside the cloner. And right now it's set to grid array. That's not what we want. We want object mode here to clone onto an object, and that object is going to be our plane. Now the orientation, as you can see, is a little bit off. So we can fix that in the transform. And let's see, probably take me all 3 tries to get it right. And of course it does. So great, we'll just rotate that 90 degrees on the bank axis there. And these are going through. And that's not ideal, but we'll make it work. Actually, that guy I would like rotated. I don't know if I'll be able to get him or her to work with me here. There we go. Another 90 there. That's looking good. And at any point, if I need these smaller, I can just come in and scale them down, right? So want to keep these pretty large at this point though. I'm going to go into the object mode here and I'm going to switch the clones to blend because that will give us some in-betweens here, right? So if I switch this quickly to linear, lower the spacing so we can see this a little bit more, we should see these shapes kind of blend together, right? You can see how it goes from one shape to the other to the other, even though it's a little bit, the orientation's a bit off here. So that will just give me even more variation in my shapes by having it set to blend here when I have object mode set. Okay, now we're obviously going to go a bit crazy with the count here. So let's just maybe start with 200. All right, that's looking good. And before we get too far, I want to get into the vertex map side of this, just so we can make sure that's working. In order to get that working, I'm going to need to put my cloner into a connect. And while I don't know if we need to do it right this second, we will once we get things moving and animating. So why not do it now? I created a connect object. I'll place my cloner inside. And the cloner just collapses this down so that Cinema 4D sees it more as a regular object instead of a MoGraph object in this case. Used in a lot of cases, really when something isn't working like you expect. When in doubt, drop it into a connect and see if that fixes it. So on our plane, I'm going to go to other tags and choose vertex map. Okay, great. Because this plane is a primitive object, we didn't have to enable use fields here. If this was something you had already made editable, you would need to check use fields and then also remove the freeze from it. But what I can do is drag the connect in here now. And what you'll see is that we have our spots in here, our droplets, I should say. So why don't we call it droplets, affecting this plane or this vertex map. Okay, now they're way too big. And so to turn the size down, I'll select the droplets, the connect object that got added to our fields here. And I'll keep this with points and I'm going to just lower that radius. Now, how low we can get away with this radius has to do with the size of our droplets or condensation or whatever you want to call it, along with the amount of polygons we have in our plane, right? So if I just hide the cloner, because we actually don't need it to be visible, you can see how pixelated this is because this vertex map is based on the number of vertices or points we have. And so if I was to double these points again to say 400 and 200, we'll see things start to get smoother. So the lower we go, or I'm sorry, the higher we go with these segments, the more smooth and detailed our end result will be. Now, you may notice that we have a little bit of a gap in there from our clones. Now, that isn't a huge deal because the clones themselves kind of fill it. But if we were going to try and adjust that, we would do that in our field section and adjust the mode here to surface, maybe see what volume does. You can see volume works, but it makes things look even more pixelated, and we don't have a way to adjust the size like we did with points or surface. Curvature doesn't really do anything for us. Oh, we get something interesting, but not quite usable with what we're currently going for. So, I don't think it's a huge deal which mode we go with right now. But yeah, so okay. That looks like it's working. The problem is we need smaller. Yeah, so unfortunately, point surface, and that's fine. We'll be okay because ultimately we would want to make these much smaller and it starts to blend together at that point. Okay, so we have our droplets, we have our map now. What we're going to do is animate this. And what I can do is turn off our connect just for some of the animation stuff. If we want things to play back a little bit quicker, notice how that vertex map went away. I'll try to keep it on, but if things aren't, playing back too smoothly for you, that may be the way to go. So a couple of different things we're going to do here with our cloner. First, I'm going to add a random effector. And this is going to be for scale. So I will call this random scale. Okay. So in our parameter tab, I will uncheck position, check on scale, and we can use uniform scale here. And I'll just set this to say -1. Now, whether I use negative or positive, it is going to make my objects both larger and smaller because in the effector tab for the minimum maximum, we have it going from -100% to positive 100%. Okay, now if I just want to make these smaller, what I can do is bring this down. And actually, because I used a -1, it's the opposite. I would want to bring this up. All right, we can see, so that's making it smaller just from 0 to 100 there. So, okay, that's going to give me, once again, just a little bit more variation. And if I want to get kind of risky, I can always scale these down a little bit. All right. Double check what my map looks like. Vertex map, I can always double the number of segments in my plane here, but I'll wait to see how the animation itself looks. So that looks pretty good for right now, size-wise. With my cloner selected again, I'm going to come over here to my effectors and choose the time effector. So the time effector, as you play it back, it's going to use the time to control what we're going to be changing here: position, scale, rotation, color, or perhaps even some other things. Now, right now, they're just rotating. That's not very useful. So I'm going to turn on position, and I really want just -y, just a little bit of movement. All right, how much? Entirely up to you. Okay. I will say, don't trust this playback speed, though. If our playback speed isn't 30 frames per second, we're not actually seeing the correct speed. So if you're not sure about that, you can always come up here to the View Configure menu, go to HUD, turn on frames per second, and see. So if I'm only getting 20, I could try turning off the Connect. That seems to help a bit. There we go. Or you could do a Make Preview. That should work as well. So that's our speed, and that works pretty well. But I really don't want the ones at the very top or bottom to kind of be moving as much, right? I don't want them to come off the side. Now, depending on how I set up the window, if this piece of glass was kind of larger than the frame and what we're seeing, that could work, and this could be a non-issue. But just to be on the safe side here, what I'm going to do is add a box field. So in the Fields tab of my time effector, I'm going to choose my box field. And with the outer part of this box field, and I'm going to switch to a right view for this, I want it to be the size of my plane, which it conveniently is. I'm going to want the height to be about the same height as well. If it's a little bit off, it's not the end of the world. And now you'll see that I'm getting the majority of the movement inside our middle. That's where the effector is being applied 100%. I can switch to the remapping tab if I want to make this a little bit larger. Okay, so that's looking pretty good. Maybe even switch the contour mode to quadratic just to kind of make that fall off a little bit less linear. So that's looking good for our movement. Once again, you could use more movement, less movement, entirely up to you. But right now, everything is moving the exact same amount. And so the way we're going to fix that is in this time field, we are going to add a random field on top of it. And so that will randomize it, though it's not very easy to see and perhaps isn't doing it as much as we would like yet. I'm going to switch the mode here from max to multiply. And now we should start to hopefully see maybe a few of these moving a little bit faster than others. And I can kind of see it, right? That one's kind of catching up to this one. It's really subtle. One thing that can help with this and make it more pronounced is by lowering the scale of our noise, right? You can see how things are kind of moving around when I do that. Keep in mind with your random field here, we can also preview it too. If you go to view settings, you can go to viewport preview. We can see that noise pattern is quite large. So, a lot of those droplets could be in the same area of that noise pattern. So I'm going to make this noise pattern smaller. Now we should get that effect perhaps a little bit more pronounced. Okay, it's, once again, kind of subtle, but there we go. The other thing I can do with this is have some of these scale. Okay, so I'm going to call this time. We'll do this position, right? So there's maybe some of these get kind of stretched out as they're moving down, but I'm going to duplicate this time now and call this time scale. Now, because I duplicated an effector, it's not immediately applied, so I will just apply it. And I haven't changed the parameter yet, so that's what I'll do now. I'll uncheck position. I'm going to check scale, and I want Y scale. I'm going to set it to something kind of ridiculous so we can just see that effect, right? So notice how these are scaling over time. That's exactly what we want. Okay. Now, once again, these droplets are too big. I would obviously want them smaller, but this effect is what we're looking for, and it's definitely much more pronounced here. So I'm happy with that for this demonstration, but in reality, these droplets would be much smaller, right? Maybe something like that. And so it's a lot less noticeable, but just adds a little bit more realism. So now we have our map, right? But the problem is we want to kind of leave a little bit of a trail behind this. And we can do that a few different ways. And to help us visualize that, I think for right now, I'll take my time position effector and increase this a little bit more so things are moving a little bit faster here. Okay. Hopefully I remember to turn that down. But in our map, there's a couple of different, our vertex map, there's a couple of different ways you can do this. Really, those are going to be decay and delay. So if I just add delay, we'll see it a little bit, but as the strength is right now, it's actually pretty subtle. So I will increase our smooth amount, and now you can kind of see it growing out. And actually, this is working, quite well. I'm pretty happy with this, right? You can see it, especially as it gets towards the end of the animation. Now, while this is looking good, the problem with this is that those trails stay on for forever. And if this was a much longer animation, that would be problematic because those streaks would get quite long. Probably should have rewinded this. But those streaks will get quite long. And so that isn't necessarily what we want here, because it can make this look pretty dirty, pretty grungy or gnarly, when really we just want it to look like, some rain droplets are falling down. So that's working okay. But the other option would be to use the decay. Now the decay is going to give us more of that kind of fading off effect, which I'm not really seeing a lot of at the moment. Let's increase the strength to see if we get more of it. There we go. Okay. So this is also working quite well. And you can see it extends for a little bit of time and then, it just kind of stays with it. So this is looking good, but really we want a combination of both. Problem is, if we use both with at 100% opacity and with how much we've turned up the strength, we're going to get some pretty long paths here. So I would definitely recommend adjusting the effect strength, perhaps even the opacity, although actually it seems to be okay. But for today, right now, I'm going to leave this as is so that we can just kind of keep working with this. Okay, so that's looking good. Now for this next part, we're going to need to work with the material, because the whole point of getting this vertex map here is to eventually have this affect the roughness so that, our glass looks like perhaps it's kind of wet, that the droplet left a little bit of condensation or liquid behind that's, changing the material. So I'm going to come in here with my dome light and load that in. So I'm going to just find my folder. Find that image. I'm not sure exactly why it wasn't finding it previously. Okay, guess it wasn't copied, even though I saved these into the same folder. So all I did was load that image into our dome light. And if we see our dome light, which would help if I switched our renderer to Redshift, that may have also had something to do with it. You can see here's what we're working with. Okay. I'm going to create a glass material, new default material, base properties, reflection roughness down to 0, transmission up to 1. That'll give us glass. I will apply that to the plane. And now if I was to start rendering this, let's name this material glass. Okay, we can kind of see what we're working with. Now, everything's still a little bit dark here, right? In fact, this isn't even, our pane of glass isn't rotated the correct way. So let's come in and rotate this so we kind of get a good view of the street. The thing we don't want out there. I always change this after. In fact, something we may want to turn on with this is thin walled mode, since we are just working with a pane of glass. There we go. A little bit hard to see the pane of glass at this point. That should be fixed once we kind of add our roughness in. So what we're going to do to add our roughness in is open our node editor, and we're going to use the vertex attribute. That allows us to use a vertex map to control a property. With the vertex attribute selected, what I'm going to do is drag that vertex map into the attribute name there. And I can now connect this to say roughness. And what we should see, there we go, is our kind of streaks. And you can see they kind of grow out as we play this once Redshift updates. And you can see though, right now things are really, really large. So once again, the ways around that are to scale these down and to increase the number of segments in our plane here. We'll do that just one more time because I'm not happy with the way that looks. I will also show you how we can dial back this effect because right now it's looking very, very strong. Okay, but select your vertex map, select your plane. And what we want to do is scale down our spheres inside of our cloner, maybe something like that. Still larger than what I had in the example, okay? You can see we're still getting streaks, but they're still pretty big. So on our plane, in the Object tab, we will double this to 800 and 400. We may need to kind of rewind and play this through. Another thing to keep in mind as well with this is in the vertex map, our droplets, if we could turn down the size there from 2 centimeters to 1, the radius that it's going to kind of expand out. And that should give us some smaller effects as well. And I didn't turn up the number of droplets, so let's do that. Let's just double that to 400. I'm probably going to have to rewind this, yep, to get that vertex map working. So that's looking good. I'll let this play a little bit and then can start our IPR here and see what we got. Cool. So if you want to dial back this effect, what we're going to do is come into our vertex attribute, open up our node editor, expand it, find our ramp. Okay. And I would just drag and drop this ramp onto our vertex attribute. So that way it gets connected to the alt input because that makes sense. You can see that actually changes this a little bit as well, probably due to some kind of color space thing. But now what we can do is work with our values here. So if you want the streaks to be more noticeable, bring the white knot in, and you'll see them, they become more noticeable. If you want them to be less noticeable, bring in the black knot there. Okay, another thing you could do, and I didn't even do this in the other example, would be to add a noise to this as well, right? So you could totally mix a noise, essentially using this as a mask on our noise to get that noise pattern to show up in that roughness. And that would be a way to break it up even further. You could also do that in your map here. If you, in your map, added a random field, right? Now it's over everything, but if you switch it to multiply, it's now only going to be where our existing stuff, our streaks are. Now it's really large, so we can turn the scale down and you can see maybe how things are kind of changing a little bit. The problem with doing it here though, is we don't have enough detail, despite having, 800 and 400 segments in this sphere, right? That's looking pretty, heavy polygon wise, but still in terms of a vertex map, we don't get as much detail as perhaps as we would like. But I'm going to call this part of this good because remember, I also wanted to go through the modeling of the window and the depth of field. So we're going to call this part good. And now I'm going to start by modeling the rest of the window. I'm going to start with a cube. And actually probably should have just started with that plane. So let's just do that. Let's just duplicate our plane again. Okay, get rid of the random field on it. Get rid of everything else on it. And I don't need all these segments. I'll reduce the segments to 1 there. And this way we have a plane that's like the exact size of our window. I'm going to make this plane editable. And I'm going to even try soloing this as well. I'm going to go into edge mode here. Select all of our edges. I still have soft selection turned on, so I'm going to turn that off. Go into scale mode because I can hold down Control and scale out those edges, and that will give me kind of the opening for my window. So I can scale that way, perhaps this way, to create kind of my room that I had. Maybe then just hold Control, switch to my scale tool to extrude those edges. Okay. I probably will want to delete that polygon here in a second. But before I do, I'm going to do a loop path cut. And I will then restrict it to my selection because I'm going to create the grid pattern here. So add one, maybe one more. Click there, add a couple here. Probably do one more than in my example just because this one's taller. And so there we go. So I will call this wall. I will duplicate it, call this frame. Then I'm just going to invert and delete. That way I now have my frame. And in my wall, I do want to delete that part. So we have our wall, which should just be the opening. We have our frame, which as of right now is still just kind of that same size polygon, is our kind of rain glass. Now what we're going to do is select all these, do an inset, uncheck preserve groups. That will allow us to kind of get that pattern there. And I'm actually going to delete these. Okay. Actually don't want these outside polygons either, so I will delete them. If I'm going a little bit fast, I do apologize. This video is already kind of long. We still have a lot to do. So delete those. Now I want to straighten out those sides. A couple of different ways you can do that. Select them, switch to your scale tool. You can just scale them down. You could also come here to your attribute manager, figure out what axis it is. In this case, it's Y. Set it to 0. Do that for this bottom one. Oops. And then do the same thing on the sides, but it will be the Z axis instead of the Y. Although I think I'm in edge mode, I typically would have done that in point mode. Still worked. What I can do now is hit Controller Command A to select all these polygons, and this dome light's annoying. Let's hide it for now. And I'm going to extrude these, but I'm going to check on create caps so that it fills in the back and kind of creates a solid object here. So maybe something like that. So there's our frame. Now if we unsolo everything, you'll see where things are starting to come together here. Okay, really I just need like a little bit of a inset here. So I'll select these, or at least try to, and then realize I need to, in my rectangular selection tool, turn on tolerance selection. So that way, as long as those objects pass that, I can select these. And unfortunately, I have all those extra polygons on here, which isn't ideal, but I'll live. I'm going to extrude these again by holding Controller Command and pulling back. Honestly, that looks pretty good. I think the only thing we're maybe missing is the little kind of piece there. See, our frame is working pretty well. I may go to a top view just to see how things are lining up here. Okay, that's really not much help. Looks like everything's kind of towards the front of it. That's fine. So we'll just create that little part. And honestly, it should just be like a cube. So create a cube, make it kind of narrow, a little bit wider than the window. I'm going to do something like that. Try to make sure it lines up here, sticks out a little bit there. And now when I move this down, there we go. Great. So maybe not the exact same as the window I made before, but it works just the same. And we have our dome light done. So let's set up our camera because that's going to be important. So I'm going to kind of frame a view, something like this, somewhat similar to what I had before. And I'm going to create a camera. And because I am using Redshift, okay, that's an area light, not a camera. Redshift, that will also kind of change the way I do this as well, because I'm not going to let the dome light here itself be our background. Instead, what I'll do is I'll look through my camera, right click on it, add a protection tag so I don't move it. But I'm going to use the background, the new background kind of section here. This is relatively new, so if you aren't seeing this, make sure you're using up-to-date version of Cinema 4D and Redshift. But I would just load my image in here, right? So just do that. Copy it. Go into my background, override, put it back there, and there it is. And you can see it's not quite as stretched or distorted because now it is stretching it to kind of fit our render view. So it does matter what you have set up as your width and height. Because if I do fit Actually, these aren't making too much of a difference at the moment, but they would if I change my aspect ratio. So if this goes to 1280, you can see now how that image, okay, it's not working for whatever reason. Maybe if we were rendering it, it would. Let's see what we got. All right, so we do stretch. You can see how it's changing. If I do crop, oops, undo that offset, or fit, right? And fit doesn't quite work because we're seeing a top. So stretch is going to have to do maybe even crop. You know, that actually doesn't look too bad. We're maybe a little bit close, whereas here we're further away. Well, the proportions, yeah, look a little bit better here. Cool. So that's looking good. Our lighting, though, needs a little bit more work. So I'll come into our dome light in the object tab, and I'm just going to increase our exposure here a little bit. You know, really when you're working with, maybe put it to like 1, lighting, you know, you want to use real HDRI. This is just kind of temporary, you know, for this type of experiment. I really wouldn't light my project like this, but lighting wise, I think we're looking pretty good. I may also come into the camera into the optical tab and adjust the exposure value as well. Because typically if, you know, the background outside a window is exposed correctly, the inside is going to be much darker. So I don't mind that little bit of extra kind of brightness out here. And it also brightens up this, which isn't too bad as well. If I just wanted to brighten up the dome light, or I'm sorry, our background, that would just be in the background section here. And I can do that with our window. All right, there we go, wrong way. So I could do it like that. And that's not going to affect the lighting. But I think that's looking pretty good. I may even turn the saturation down on the dome light a little bit, just because, yeah, it was a little kind of pink or red. Cool. So that's looking good. Now we just have materials and the fact I have that overlapping geometry right there. Okay, so what I'll probably do is take that glass and just move it behind the frame. You know, depending on the type of window, that frame could be inside the glass. Could also not be, just depends on the window, but that looks pretty good. And for the materials, I really didn't do anything too crazy. Let's name some things here. I think this is called the plinth. Could be wrong. We have our frame. We have our wall, and then lastly, our glass, which already has its material on it. Cool. So for the plinth, what I did is just search for Redshift materials. It would help if I could spell Redshift right. Okay, click on materials, and just kind of came through here. And for the frame, I just found a white ceramic. For the plinth, you could do wood. I used like one of these granite things, even though I wasn't terribly thrilled with them. So we'll grab that. And then, oh darn it, I don't have really a place to add metal like I did in the previous one, but see if we can find something for a wall. Maybe like a white plaster. Do we have a white plaster? Okay. Give that a shot. Put that on our wall. We are kind of in, I'm guessing that's somewhere in Europe. I could be wrong, but they may not just have a drywall like you would expect in America. Oh, I'm not sure if that's the way it's going to look when we render, but let's switch our projection here to cubic. Hopefully that will help, or not. Always trust what you see rendered and not what you see in your perspective view, or even your material previews for that matter. So I could also come in and maybe add a bevel deformer to our frame. Not the frame. Yeah, actually, the frame is what I want. Just the little grid pattern there. So that's a bit too big. So maybe we do like 0.3. Maybe increase the subdivisions a little bit. Yes, just round that out a little bit. Maybe do the same thing here. Add a fillet. Maybe 0.5. All right. Really, this shouldn't be going outside there, but we'll live with it for today. And let's kind of see what we get at this point. Where we're at with this. I think we're done with the materials and lighting. At this point, to kind of finish this off, I'm going to increase the count substantially. So let's just do like 4,000, right? Really make it add a lot more droplets. Let's see, come on, there we go. What we didn't do is create a water material for a droplet. So let's do that. Water, and I'm just gonna use glass. So nothing too crazy going on here. Set transmission to 1 and your roughness to 0. Apply that on the droplets, or even the cloner would work. And that will make them not nearly as noticeable, right? That's starting to look pretty good. And so I'll pause that to kind of preview this without materials, right? So we can kind of see what we're getting. And now I try to do my best to avoid it, but we are getting some slow playback, at least on my machine. But if we want to kind of see what we're getting, then this is what we need to do. Oh, does my frame not go to the edge there? I could always move that out. But all right, let's see what we get with that. See if we can see some of these streaks. So interestingly, the droplets look great. I'm not sure we're seeing the streaks. So let's play this a little bit longer. And if we need to, go back into the glass material and work with that ramp. And I think, like I said, that's probably where I'll leave this. The frame, I don't know if I'll be able to do that as it's playing back. Doesn't really look like it. Please don't crash on me. Okay, so we played a little bit more. I'm not going to get too greedy here. Let's start this render one last time. Okay, so I saw things move. Let's dial up our streaks. There we go. Starting to see them a little bit more. They're obviously a bit larger than I would like. You know, but like I said, we could keep working with that. I can't remember if I did have that random field in there. So let's turn that off. Maybe that'll help. Okay, it did help. Probably shouldn't have changed it. So back in here, let's just pull that white knot back to the right. That should shrink that down. Maybe even just a touch more. Back to where I had it initially, of course. Okay, cool. And like I said, still would go smaller with these, but hopefully you're seeing the result. The last thing I would do with this is to add some depth of field. And I'm going to go back into my Redshift camera, back into the optical section here, check on the focus distance, and you know, click on my window somewhere there, and then start to lower the aperture till I'm happy with the amount of depth of field. Obviously, this isn't the most realistic way to do it. It would help if you turn bokeh on. Okay, so now we're starting to kind of blur the background a little bit, which is great. Maybe go just a little bit, because I feel like I don't think we're getting too blurry there. Can maybe even push in a little bit. We don't see quite as much of the wall, because that's not fun. Maybe something like that. Back with the protection tag in the camera. The optical section again. Double check your focus distance. All right, so that's looking pretty good. And honestly, yeah, that's where I think we're going to leave this. Once again, would definitely go smaller with this. I may want to double check this material, make sure it was set to cubic for the projection. But overall, I'm pretty happy with the way this turned out, pretty happy with the movement we get. And if you want to see the movement a little bit quicker, remember, you can always turn off the connect, and we'll see that a little bit more, a little bit better. So yeah, I think this is as good as we're going to get it for today. That will do it for this video. If there's anything else you would like to see, please leave a comment below. And until next time, take care.